try to answer these during the webcast. You can find additional answers to some common technical issues located via the help button at the top of your screen. We value your opinions and appreciate your participation in today's presentation. And with that, I'm Jack Jacobson. I'm an advisor at Thomson Coburn. I've been at the firm a little over 2 years and have been a federal energy climate change lobbyist for a little over 20 years. And I'm joined by my colleague, Jayna Rust. Jayna?
Hi, my name is Jayna Rust, and I'm an attorney in the Government Contracts and Public Transportation group here at Thomson Coburn. And I work with contractors and anyone really who gets federal funds, helping them understand what they need to be doing to keep receiving federal funds, as well as help them litigate against the government whenever that comes up. So without much further ado, I think we can get started, if that's okay with you, Jack.
Perfect.
So, sorry, I'm trying to make sure. I hope folks can see our screens for the day. This just kind of gives you an overview of what we're going to be talking about today. I think most of you who signed up probably already have an idea of what we'll be talking about today, but this is a slightly different order than what you may have seen on some of the sign-up materials. And the first slide, I just wanted to show as an overview of where we are right now. And I think one of the things that to me is kind of an overarching theme of what we might be seeing, and I know Jack has also some additional thoughts on this as well, is that there's really not been a lot of presidents that we've seen that come in with the experience as a vice president with the full intent to change course from the prior administration. We've had a lot of, 15 to be exact, former vice presidents become president, and that's kind of that first maroony color there, as well as all of the other dark maroon and kind of pinkish colors on this chart. So about 15 of our presidents, of our 46 presidents, had been vice presidents previously. 6 of those came in directly through election rather than through the death of a president or the resignation. And really, only 2 of them came in not directly from the vice presidential role and when there was a change in administrations. And that's really just President Nixon and President Biden, which I do think starts to influence a little bit of what we see happening in the administration right now. And this chart here really shows the number of executive orders that presidents between Nixon and Biden, the number of executive orders that those presidents have issued, as well as the number of presidential memoranda they've issued. There's some debate on the difference between the two. I don't think it's really necessary for today's conversation to go into details on the differences between them, but I think it's very easy to see from this chart that President Biden has issued more executive orders in the first couple of weeks of his administration than any other president we've had since President Nixon, and even including President Nixon. And also noting from this chart, there's a lot of them that deal with government contracts. So all of the maroonish colored ones deal with government contracts somewhat directly. It's not a perfect science, this chart, but it is just to kind of give you an idea of what kinds of executive orders we're seeing and how many. And Jack, I know you had some thoughts on why we see as many executive orders as we do sometimes versus others.
Yeah, I think this is a fundamental change to how our federal government operates. Congress is more deadlocked than ever. There's the narrowest of Democratic majorities right now. And when it's really difficult to pass legislation, you have to turn to the executive branch to see real change. And so you've seen over the years, as Congress has passed fewer bills on an annual basis, you've seen the executive branch really take that power and use the power of the purse, the power of executive orders to really implement change. And I think we're going to continue to see this. It's, to some degree, it's the legislative branch ceding authority to the executive. And that's a change I don't think everyone's quite grasped fully yet. I've been a lobbyist for 21 years. In my first 7 years, we had 3 big energy bills pass Congress and be signed into law. And in the past 14 years, the past 2/3 of my career, we've had 1 energy bill passed, and that was included in the omnibus that just passed in December, and was really focused on energy efficiency and technology investments, not really structural changes to energy markets or things of that nature. So, so that gives the president a lot of power, and but he's limited in that he can't change the law, right? He can only he can use his executive authority to sort of redirect the ship through the power of the purse.
And I think the redirecting of the ship is definitely something we're seeing here, as far as a number of these executive orders from President Biden in these first couple of weeks were reversing prior executive orders from the Trump administration. So without laws in place, one president can come in and revoke the prior president's executive orders, and as you kind of described it, reverse ship as far as the direction everything is taking on certain policies if there's not a law already in place. And I think that's some of the things that we were seeing here as well. So before we move on, I think after this, all of the rest of the slides are really on the more substantive topics. They're not really on the overview side of things, and we're not going to keep those on the screen just to make it a little bit easier for folks to hear what we're saying. But also, we did want to give you guys slides so that you had them there in case you wanted to follow along or take notes on anything. So that's why we're going to stop sharing the screen here, but you guys still have some slides to follow along if you'd like. All right. So I guess then moving on into regulations and enforcement generally. And I think, Jack, I don't know from your side if that's something that comes up with a lot of your clients. Are they asking those kinds of questions now? I know that's coming up as a question from us on the government contract side.
Yeah, everyone's trying to look around corners and see what's coming up. And this is where having a Washington team is really helpful, because you've got members of Congress that are in constant contact with the Biden administration, pushing him, asking him to put out executive orders or to change policies or to start to develop new regulations. And folks don't want to get caught flat-footed. So now's a really good time to be watching webinars like this and learning about what's coming down the track.
Yeah, and I mean, I think there's a perception, and I don't necessarily think it's a wrong perception, but I do think there is a perception that Democratic administrations tend to more heavily focus on regulations, and there tends to be more regulations coming out of administrations headed by a Democrat. And I think that, you know, some folks have that perception, but also we've seen that President Biden has already started to take some steps in paving the way for more regulation. He already revoked the Trump administrative order on repealing 2 regulations for every new regulation issued. So there's certainly some steps being taken to put in place more regulations. But I think we're also seeing that there's going to be a little bit of a delay in getting those regulations out. There's been a freeze on all of the regulations that were considered under the Trump administration. And then, you know, so that's going to create a little bit of a bottleneck until the Biden administration gets to review all of them. But then even just all of the appointees and all of those things that have to go through the Senate, that slows things down a fair amount. So even though I think there's probably going to be some more regulations, it's still going to, it's not going to be coming out this month, for instance. I think it's going to take a little bit of time before we see that. And yeah, go ahead, Jack.
When I counsel folks about the regulatory atmosphere, businesses want certainty. Organizations want certainty. They want to know what the rules are so they can design their mission and their goal around those regulations. So I think not all regulations are bad. Some are good and actually set rules that are more fair, that allow greater transparency and open up new markets for folks.
Yeah, and I think what's a little interesting to me is there's some areas for government contracts where the Trump administration kind of was focused on transparency in the regulations that were coming out of the administration. And the Biden administration is starting, or the campaign at least, had focused on enforcement areas. And enforcement, I think, is traditionally viewed as a more Republican administration use of executive power. But there was definitely some enforcement actions that were discussed by Biden on the campaign trail. And, we'll talk about those, I think, later today. But I do think that's a little bit of an interesting twist on what we've traditionally seen. But then, do you want to go ahead and move on to the first truly substantive topic?
Yes.
All right. All right. So I can start, or do you want to take the lead, Jack? I'm okay with either.
Perfect.
All right. So domestic preference policies are something that I think were obviously key to the Trump administration's campaign platform before becoming the Trump administration. There was the Buy American, Hire American, ideal that was then made into an executive order. And then there were a couple of other executive orders that came out from the Trump administration. But just to give folks an idea of really how these things play out, there's what we call domestic preference policies, and Trump called them Buy American laws. The Biden administration is not referring to them with the same language. They are calling them the Made in America laws. So we've got these different words used to describe these same things, which in government contracts, many of you guys may call them domestic preference policies. But essentially, this is a system of preferences, obligations, and exceptions related to buying things with a domestic sourcing ideal behind them. And I say sourcing because it may be more than that, especially for some of these under the cargo preference requirements. But essentially, these are domestic supporting laws that apply to specific procurements. And the Biden administration has focused on already increasing transparency in the government's application of these types of laws. The Biden administration early on has issued an executive order called Ensuring the Future is Made in All of America by All of America's Workers. So I think some of the big things that were, as far as the most direct impacts from that executive order, is that there is a requirement that a waiver of the Buy American requirements made in the public interest are now going to require a review under dumping and subsidization, which for those of you guys who work in international trade, those concepts are very common to you all. For folks who are questioning whether or not they could get a waiver based on the public interest and aren't familiar with that, you're probably going to be engaging with some folks who are very knowledgeable in trade. The government side is going to be consulting with the International Trade Administration before granting such waivers. So that's one area that the executive order made a change. But I think the most visible change that we will see in government contracts is going to be a White House OMB, Office of Management and Budget, Made in America office. And this office is really going to review and make determinations on waivers related to these domestic preference policies. And if there's some disagreement between this OMB office and the agency on whether or not a waiver should be granted, it can get elevated. But not only is that office going to be reviewing waiver requests from agencies, which is something we have not seen before. There hasn't been a centralized office for this review, but they're also going to be providing information to GSA for a public website to make all of the waiver requests themselves public, as well as the determinations made on them. So this website isn't going to just have granted waivers, it's going to have all requests for waivers. And I think that's something that is going to be a little bit different for folks. And there's also, and I think from what that means from a government contractor standpoint is it's going to make a couple of things happen. One, it may provide some more certainty for contractors when they're seeking waivers to have an idea of what's been granted or not in the past. So I think it's going to provide some contractors a little more certainty before they even go in and ask for a waiver to have an idea of whether or not it will be granted, which will be helpful for some. I think it's also, though, potentially going to decrease the likelihood that contractors are going to ask for waivers if they know their company name is going to be associated with that, because ultimately there's probably going to be some PR efforts to go after companies that are trying to get waivers to some of these requirements. The other thing that we noticed in this executive order is that there is going to be an additional level of review before adding an item to the Federal Acquisition Regulations list of non-available articles. So there is a list in the FAR that the FAR Council maintains of non-available articles. Those items don't have to be subject to the Buy American Act. And so now, before anything gets added to that, there's going to be an additional level of review. Before I move on that, I know, Jack, you have some thoughts on kind of how infrastructure is going to be impacted on some of these domestic preference policy type things. Did you want to hop in?
Yeah. So infrastructure, the big the big legislative package that everyone's been waiting for I don't know, 6 years, 8. It became a rolling joke in the last administration that every week was going to be infrastructure week, and at the end of the day, Congress just couldn't come together to pass a package. And one of the main problems was how to fund a package. I think we're in very different economics status at this point, and Congress has been less shy about deficit spending in the last few years, and particularly now when we're in a recession, we hope that's all it is. I think there might be a little more appetite to go big. I think you still have the party politics that's going to be a problem, but I think there's an impetus to pass a big infrastructure package, perhaps under another reconciliation bill that only requires a simple majority. Now, there are provisions that could be put into that legislation, perhaps, that could go farther around contracting and procurement than the Biden administration can do unilaterally. And it's unclear yet what those provisions will look like, but certainly it's going to be a goal of, I think, that the majorities in both houses to make sure that we strengthen American manufacturing capabilities, and if the federal government's spending money, that perhaps American companies get to be first in line if they can provide the product or service. I did have a question about that being first in line. To what degree can the administration buy American first? And what I'm getting at there is we're also a part of a global economy, and we have a World Trade Organization, and we have the US, Canada, Mexico agreement that is supposed to help the flow of goods and services across borders. And so to what degree will those factor into how far administration can go in this new Made in America office?
Well, and so I think what's interesting is the Made in America office is going to be dealing with all waivers of the Buy American Act, and as well as the Buy America Act, as well as the Cargo Preference Acts. But one of the most common waivers of the Buy American Act, which is under the FAR and applies to most government contractors, is the Trade Agreements Act. And that basically requires us to comply with all of our trade agreements and, make sure that we are providing certain preferences to our trade partners. And so the number of procurements that are subject to the Buy American Act versus the Trade Agreements Act, with all of the waivers as far as the main kind of country of origin analysis that applies under those contracts, it tends to be, most contracts are really looking at their compliance under the Trade Agreements Act. and whether or not they meet all of those obligations. There are, of course, certainly many contracts that are subject to the Buy American Act, but those, are somewhat limited in number as far as what they apply to. What's interesting, though, that the executive order really did focus on the Buy American Act, and in a couple of other ways that it's interesting to kind of think about how there is some kind of agreement with the Trump administration on some of these things that were coming out, because the executive order did require the FAR Council, so the people who are in charge of revising the FAR, to consider proposing for notice and comment changes to the FAR that would replace the component test under the Buy American Act, that would increase the threshold for domestic content requirements, and that would increase price preferences under the Buy American Act. However, a couple of those things were just done by the Trump administration, really kind of down to the wire as far as timing goes. I think the FAR rule was issued on January 19th and took effect on January 21st, with the requirement that it start being in solicitations come February 22nd. That regulatory freeze that I mentioned earlier, it's not 100% clear how that's going to apply to that rule, but given the agreement that the parties, the Trump administration and Biden administration have on the, idea to at least increase these items, I suspect that those are going to continue to roll out and we'll start seeing those in contracts come February 22nd, but that's not guaranteed. But, that is definitely something we might see, but that still, doesn't touch on all of these other domestic preference policies that may be impacted by the Trade Agreements Act. And I think another interesting thing from that executive order is, though, the potential for information technology that's a commercial item to be subject to some of these domestic preference policy requirements. Typically, those have been exempt from the Buy American Act, so the Biden administration is looking at how they can do that. I suspect that's going to be an area where there's going to be a fair amount of behind the scenes discussions with the administration. There's going to be some executive agency type lobbying on what goes into that, as well as the notice and comment on that is going to have a lot of, I think, discussion. But then also another area that I think is really going to get to some of that infrastructure type things, and probably is going to be something that is going to be heavily lobbied within the executive branch, is this idea of critical materials. The Trump administration had identified some medicines and medicine-related things as critical materials that had to be sourced with U.S. origin components or U.S. supply chains. And that came out, I think his executive order was August of 2020. And we're gonna, I think, see by the Biden campaign had noted that they were going to look to expand this idea of critical materials, and noted that they were going to look at that in particular with public transportation projects. So things subject to the Buy America Act, I think, are going to have that as well as a consideration from the administration. And I think we're going to see a number of industries jockeying to be considered critical materials under this administration because of a number of reasons. But I think those are some of the things we're going to see. And I know, related to the infrastructure side of things, I think that's probably a really good segue into the climate change aspect of things, because so much of infrastructure is going to be impacted by some of these views on climate change. Jack, did you want to start off on that, if that's okay?
Yeah, of course. The infrastructure package is going to be a package to combat climate change. They're no longer separate. If we're spending federal dollars and Democrats have control right now, those dollars that are spent are going to be focused on carbon reduction and climate change mitigation, resiliency, those types of things. So when we hear that the federal government has a domestic discretionary budget of some $600 billion a year annually, right? If you don't count the COVID relief packages and whatnot. And a lot of that money is going to be shifted to projects and products that lower carbon emissions, tackle climate change, or build up things like seawalls. That's going to be really important. The military, the Department of Defense, is really leading the charge on this. They are probably the biggest investor in climate change research and climate change products in the world. And we're going to see a redoubling of those efforts within the administration. I think all of the cabinet secretaries are going to be focused on this. Certainly Secretary Buttigieg is going to be laser focused on this. And then you have just larger policies, the Biden administration deciding that the federal vehicle fleet is going to go all electric. That's one real concrete example of putting your dollars into infrastructure that combats climate change. We've got a federal vehicle fleet of about 650,000 vehicles. And if those all turn electric, you're not just buying the electric vehicles, you're buying all of the supports for those electric vehicles. And that includes charging stations and new shops, right, to fix the vehicles. And you're going to be integrating smart technology so that the roadway signs and lights and infrastructure can coordinate and communicate with the electric vehicle fleet. And it's just it's a huge endeavor, and this will allow the market to evolve much more rapidly. And you're not going to see that just in vehicles, right? You're also seeing that in other products, from buying computers that are highly energy efficient to building materials and data infrastructure. That we're going to see such a swift change over the next 12 to 24 months in how the federal government spends its dollars. And this infrastructure package is going to be a huge down payment on that. The president put together his campaign, put out his plan to spend $2 trillion on infrastructure, and investing 40% of those funds into climate justice or environmental justice projects, meaning 40% of those dollars need to be directed to those that have been most damaged by environmental pollution over the last 200 and some years. So how that is crafted in the infrastructure package, how the president and his administration read those rules or decide those rules for what counts as environmental justice spending is going to be really important. And we are not quite sure yet how that's going to look, but it's going to be a combination. We're going to need a contract lawyer like you, and we're going to need a lobbyist like me to help figure it out and make sure the rules are written in such a way that they're most effective and still work for our capitalist system.
Yeah, and I mean, I think, the timeline you laid out is interesting, in part because at this point, I mean, and we are just 2.5 weeks, I guess, in maybe 3 weeks into, close to 3 weeks into the administration. But, and so really the only concrete things we've seen from the administration are executive orders for plans, committees, reviews. But we do know, I mean, based on things that are coming out of the Hill, as well as the campaign trail from the Biden administration, where these priorities are. So even if we haven't seen anything directly on this yet, there's, I think some pretty good indicators from both on that. And I think what's going to be interesting then from the contractor side, as things start to come out on these, especially something like vehicle procurements are a good example. There's going to be, I think, some creative contracting that's going to have to happen from the government side, because, right now, even if the government has to still procure traditional vehicles and they're not buying electric vehicles for whatever reason in this next round, there's probably going to be different options that are considered there, or potentially leases rather than purchases, so that they can comply with something they think is going to be coming down the pipeline later. I think we'll also start to see, even in the maintenance side of things, there's going to be options in there where the government's going to try to protect itself from this idea that there's going to be a lot more people working in this industry, so that the costs of some of these services may go down. You know, I think we're just going to see, hopefully, some creative contracting happening there to address some of these things as they come out. I think one of the other areas that the Biden campaign, at least, you know, seemed to have some interest other than the electric vehicles, because that was certainly an area that was mentioned, you know, in the campaign, was the area for batteries as well. There seems to be a focus from the Biden folks as far as accelerating research and supporting the development of domestic production capability in that. So we're probably going to see, given the focus on the research and then the development of domestic production capability, you know, some kinds of contracts from the SBIR program and things like that, you know, focus on building up the American knowledge in this area, as well as the American production capabilities.
Yeah, and we have our first question. And by the way, if you have questions on this, please use the Q&A function at the bottom. I think it's on the bottom right hand of my screen. But one person has written, my experience is that the electric vehicles manufacturers are not that nimble to produce products. So I doubt that Biden can change this in 12 to 24 months with an industry that is not moving fast enough to keep up with new technologies. I think that's right. I said that 12 to 24 months because we're going to start shifting generally product to more efficient products and to newer technologies. The bigger the item, the longer that timeline is probably going to look. But if we're looking at, you know, computers and smartphones and things of that nature, those are going to be more near term. Big items like how a building is constructed or the vehicle fleet that we're going to rely on, those are going to be longer timelines. So I think that the president has sort of set 2035 as his goal for most of these big initiatives. And so electric vehicles, I think, would be certainly more than the 24 months. But what the Biden administration is doing is indicating that's where the money is going to go. And that, again, when we talked about certainty way at the beginning, companies can feel more certain now that they can invest in the research and development they need to do. They can invest in the manufacturing facilities that they're going to need to create, knowing that there will be a market there, at least from the federal government, and then likely as well from the private sector.
Yeah, and I think we're going to see a slightly, there's a lot of different things that are also electric vehicles. You know, there's buses that are we're talking about, you know, the large passenger buses that are used by transit authorities or the Department of Defense to move a lot of their members. Then there are vans. One of the areas that I know the Biden administration has talked about is the U.S. Postal Service. So thinking about those kinds of vehicles as well as something that's probably a little smaller than the electric buses, and that probably has a slightly more compressed production time frame. And then moving on to true, you know, sedans and you know, other types of what we think of as the typical on-the-road vehicle. So, you know, this idea of the fleet encompasses more than just buses, vans. You know, it also, I think, does encompass some of the regular passenger cars that we think of, and not just the cargo kind of or large passenger kind of items.
Two more questions have come in, Jayna.
Yeah.
You mentioned that there will be a focus on energy efficient computers. What impact do you believe this would have on information technology services, for example, handling data, cybersecurity, et cetera? I'll start, and Jayna, you can help me out here. Data is huge for the federal government, and they invest a lot in data management, and there's just more data available. When we talked about transparency, when Jayna talked about transparency at the beginning, data is is one way to get transparency, to know that if a vendor is maybe reducing CO2 emissions by creating a more streamlined construction process for a federal building or reconstruction process, those companies may have to provide all of that data on the back end to the federal government, and or federal contracts could have included in them provisions that say that IT vendors may have to share certain data with the federal government. So I think there's going to be a lot of investment in IT services and making that smarter and letting the federal government analyze data, as the Department of Energy does frequently, to make sure that the research and development is going in the right direction as well, and that those investments that the federal government makes, which are significant, are really helping plug holes in a system. Jayna, what did I miss there?
I don't think you missed anything. I mean, the one point I would add to that, I think actually ties into the next question as well. And that question was whether or not we could provide any insight on how the Buy American changes will impact EV changes, so electric vehicle charging station manufacturers, including those based in some place like Canada, so one of our trade partners. I think one of the things that the Biden administration has made clear, and as well as the Biden campaign made clear back before he was elected, was that these climate change policies aren't going to impact or take away from the other policies. So the idea of, you know, these Buy American kind of policies are still going to, they're going to have to go hand in hand. And I don't think that the focus on climate change is going to override any of those other existing policies. You know, so that goes to like the cybersecurity aspect of that last question as well. You know, I think those are all things that, if it comes down to a choice, the administration is going to fall more toward the protecting cybersecurity. If they have a choice between protecting Buy American Act policies or climate change policies, I think they're going to go toward the Buy American Act kind of things. But what I think the administration is trying to do is make sure that they're setting up a system so that there's not a choice.
Yeah, and I think this is, again, this is a place where Presidents Trump and Biden aren't that far apart. In his final months in office, President Trump signed some executive orders about that were specific to shoring up cybersecurity, and he did that by creating a preference for purchasing American products when available, or securing the supply chain and reviewing the supply chain, so that critical infrastructure like electricity transmission systems were made primarily in America. And that would help, in theory, reduce foreign actors that might, or any actors that might compromise those systems.
Yeah, and I do think that the efforts by the Biden administration to build up the American knowledge, so the research and production capabilities, for instance, in the battery market, is going to decrease the need to rely on some of our trade partners even in this area, because where, you know, those companies may be based in other countries at this point, to the extent the new companies or existing companies develop those things in the United States and develop the production capabilities here, there's not going to need to be the exceptions or waivers that may have been used in the past.
Yeah,
but
and we do have to build up our domestic capabilities, and that's going to take time too.
Yes, because it doesn't take, it takes, as you know, I think that one question indicated, it definitely takes more than 12 months for us to build up a production capability for something like that. But I know, you know, and I'll be honest, whenever, you know, I was looking at the time frame for everything, I think we're on schedule. I think these two topics and then the next one are the three kind of biggest areas of the Biden administration as far as things that are happening and to look out for. So to the extent folks are getting a little nervous that we're not going to get through everything, I suspect after we get through the labor and employment side of things are going to be moving very, very quickly. Because I do think it's clear that the domestic preference policies have been top of mind for this administration. I think, you know, it's been clear to the two of us that the climate change policies are top of mind for this administration. And then I think labor and employment it's very clear that that's going to be top of mind, and traditionally has been for Democrat, headed administrations. But, and some of those things are going to come from what we call the OFCCP, so the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs at Department of Labor. And on the campaign trail, and I'll actually start by saying all of this labor and employment aspects of things, I don't think we've seen an executive order yet on labor and employment. Most of what we're going to see here is going to be coming from the Department of Labor, and in particular from this Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs. But one of the things that on the campaign trail Biden had focused on was increased enforcement of existing laws and regulations. And he actually named, on his website, the areas that he was going to focus on as far as enforcement, one of which was wage discrimination. We saw under the Trump administration, there started to be a growing focus on promotion discrimination. But now we're going back to this idea of wage discrimination is probably going to be the bigger focus on enforcement. The Biden campaign had also mentioned that they would look at the Vietnam era Veterans Readjustment Assistance Act hiring benchmark. Those of you guys who've had to develop a benchmark or use the government's benchmark have an idea of what that is. It's a little unclear to me how the enforcement of that could work, given that it's just a benchmark and there's not actually something to enforce at this point. But that's something that may be coming down the pipeline. He did also mention in his campaigns that he'd look at Section 503 of the Rehabilitation Act, which again had, something that's not really easy to enforce. So it's going to be interesting to see how the administration looks to ramp up enforcement in that area. And then another was for wage protections for federally funded infrastructure projects. So nothing that's really new there, but it's, really just trying to enforce those existing laws. And, another area that or another consideration for the enforcement side of things is that it's probably going to look very different. At this point, the administration can just shift federal employees their activities and priorities. There's not a lot they can do as far as funding goes, but the Biden campaign had mentioned that he would be seeking increased funding for enforcement. So that's something, though, that we can't see until the next fiscal year. So that's going to be in budget requests. It's going to take a while for it to get into the budget, assuming it's approved. And so then we're probably not even going to see that additional, or the impact from those additional funds, until at earliest October of this year. But then that's assuming that there's a big enough bump in the funds to make that difference.
When you talk about enforcement, what do those enforcement outcomes look like? To what degree is it sort of being transparent and trying to get organizations to comply with, let's say, Davis-Bacon prevailing wage, and just saying, okay, this organization isn't doing it? And to what degree is it going to be dollars on the table, right? Like fines for non-compliance?
Well, and that was one of the interesting things about the Trump administration is under the prior OFCCP director, he was really focused, that OFCCP director was really focused on transparency and making sure that what his office was enforcing was well known by the contractors and that contractors understood what they needed to in order to comply. That I don't know that there was that focus in the administration before him and the director before him. Don't know yet if that's going to be in the as part of the focus as far as this incoming director. But I mean, it can come in a number of different ways, but it does come oftentimes in settlement agreements. So depending on what kind of action has been brought this to the attention of OFCCP, it could be, dollars on the table. It could also just be an agreement to do better in the future. But then there's other areas where the Biden administration has said that they are going to look at debarment, and push for concept debarring contractors who don't comply with some of these existing laws. And so basically prohibiting these contractors from getting future awards if they violate some of these laws. And related to that, the contractors who've been around since the Obama administration would remember probably the Obama executive order on fair pay and safe workplaces. And that was something that was heavily opposed by industry. There had been a lawsuit on that before the end of the Obama administration that basically put a stay on it getting implemented, and then the Trump administration revoked it. But one of the things that executive order did was make contracting officers consider a contractor's history of compliance with the labor laws as part of the responsibility determination that must happen before every contract is awarded. And I say that's one of the things because a lot of other things that executive order did, but that is the one thing that the Biden administration has noted about that executive order and has noted that they are going to push to reinstate. So we do expect that there's going to be some enforcement from kind of the contract side as well. I think it's going to take some time for that to happen, given all of the opposition that happened under Obama's Fair Pay and Safe Workplaces executive order. But we do expect to see that kind of enforcement coming down the line. And I think from that same office, the office of OFCCP, Ginny Yang was appointed the director of that office. And while she was commissioner at EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, she had spearheaded pay data there, the collection of pay data. And it wasn't, I think, as robust as people had wanted it to be there for a number of reasons. But I think everybody who's been kind of watching that from the industry side expects that there's going to be some effort now to collect pay data from contractors again under this administration. It's certainly not a guarantee. It wasn't part of the Biden campaign that I saw, but given the appointment of her there, as well as the focus on wage discrimination, it's, I think, very likely that we'll see some effort to collect some of that information from contractors, which, from a contractor perspective of, if you haven't been paying attention to these things yet, now is a good time to make sure you're doing that, so that if, some of these things do start to play out in a year or two, given how long it may take for some of this to roll out, you'll be prepared to address and deal with that. Did you have, I know, Jack, right now on the Hill, one of the big questions is minimum wage. Do you have thoughts on that before I kind of mention how that may play out from the contractor side? Because the what's on the Hill now isn't focused on contractors, right?
No, it's not. It's just basic minimum wage across the country. I think if I understand it correctly, the Biden administration has the ability to set its own minimum wage that the federal government and its contractors and subcontractors must pay for federal contracts. And that could be different than, let's say, the person working at the coffee shop down the street and what their minimum wage might be. So certainly this is part of discussions in the reconciliation bill. And does a $15 minimum wage actually impact the federal government's budget if it's a national minimum wage? Senator Sanders, who's chair of the Senate Budget Committee, is arguing that yes, the raising the minimum wage will have an impact on the federal budget, so it can be done through reconciliation. So you really only need 50 votes plus one in each chamber, 50% of the votes plus one in each chamber. And then you get some pushback as well, saying that it's not germane to a bill that's supposed to be focused on the federal government's budgets and spending. So that debate is very active and will be continuing. And a reminder that this is a phased-in minimum wage, so it wouldn't even take full effect until I think 2025. So, and then I think there was a report out today by the GAO that said that the $15 minimum wage would raise 900,000 Americans out of poverty, which is great, but it also said that over 1 million jobs could be lost at the same time. So if you lift up almost 1 million people, but then you unemploy 1 million people, is the trade-off? What's the trade-off? And I think at the end of the day, it's about values, and Congress is going to have to decide what it wants to do. But the Biden administration, I think, can act unilaterally on some fronts.
Yeah, and that's what we saw. The current minimum wage was set under an Obama executive order, and right now the current federal contractor minimum wage, I believe, is close to $11, $10.95, I believe. And so that's really the floor of what contractors can pay their wage employees. And Biden had heavily campaigned on a promise to raise the contractor minimum wage to $15, which, you know, becomes moot if Congress applies that across the board to the whole country, regardless of whether somebody is a contractor employee or not. But that is something that, you know, potentially may be coming down the pipeline if Congress doesn't do something where it is. And, you know, I think now might also be a good time to move on to some of those other topics. I think there are a couple of other areas in the labor and employment area that are common. I think we'll see, of course, union support from the Biden administration. And I say, of course, given that his Secretary of Labor was a president of a union, I think that's very likely we're going to see more enforcement in that area. And there's going to be more efforts to curb employment discrimination. But beyond employment discrimination, there does seem to be an effort by this administration to already look at diversity and inclusion. And some of the ways that the campaign had suggested they might look at this, I won't talk about all of them, but a couple of them I think are relevant to a lot of contractors, one of which is enforcing Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act. And that's something that requires that information and communication technology is accessible and reflects the needs of people with varying types of disabilities. So I think we're going to see some kind of enforcement mechanism on that. We've been seeing some lawsuits from the commercial side on that, but I think we'll start to see a bit more of enforcement from the federal government on that. And then another area that's really kind of at odds with what the Trump administration had done, though, is Biden had campaigned on a platform to develop and institute implicit bias training programs for contractors. The Trump administration had issued an executive order that prohibited certain types of trainings on implicit bias, potentially, depending on how you interpreted the executive order and the guidance from OFCCP. But that was that executive order has been revoked, and I think we'll probably see a reversal from the Trump administration, not just a revocation of that executive order, but I think we're going to see the Biden administration pushing for trainings specific on these kinds of concepts. But then the small business side of things, we also have seen some action had seen quite a bit of action from the Trump administration on small business regulations. And under the Trump administration, the hub zone regulations were significantly revised. And part of that was really make them more workable for both the hub zone contractors, so historically underutilized business zone contractors, as well as the contracting offices that were using those entities. But some of the things that we're seeing, or at least that's been some early indications from the Biden side of things, is that there's going to be a focus here on 8A programs. The 8A programs, some people call them small disadvantaged businesses. There was an effort, or at least the Biden campaign had said that they would work to extend the maximum length of time that a firm can participate in the 8A program. The campaign had said they would look at revising the off-ramp procedures to better support graduating entities, and also look to ways to use 8A businesses better. So requiring primes to develop and execute plans specific for 8A participants, seek to triple the government-wide 8A goal from 5% to 15%, and doing a number of different things like that. A couple of other things were mentioned, but I think those are going to be some of the bigger ones. Some other things the campaign had suggested the administration would do is using formula-based awards as part of the small business contracting strategy. I haven't seen how the campaign thought that would play out. I also haven't seen anything from the administration now that they've started to show how that would play out. I'll be very interested to see that myself. There's also going to be a review on contract bundling to see if agencies are following those requirements that already exist, as well as requiring prime contractors to publish their business diversity data. So those are the main things that I think we've been seeing or had been hearing from the Biden side of things as far as what to expect for small businesses. And then the ethics and transparency side of things. I found this to be interesting in part for, I know Jack's smiling on this. I mean, I think there were a number of interesting things coming out from the Biden campaign as far as how to address some ethics sides of things. One of the things he's done, or President Biden has done early on, is something that's been very common now for presidents coming in, which is an ethics pledge, essentially, for their appointees as far as the lobbying they can do after they leave. Biden has issued that. Trump had done that, but had actually revoked that at the end of his time in office. So all of the Trump appointees who had made that commitment no longer, in theory, have to comply with that executive order. But then the campaign platform also took aim at lobbying from contractors, suggesting that he may look at ways to eliminate contractors' personnel, including their officers and directors, from contributing to federal campaigns. At this point, companies themselves cannot contribute to federal campaigns, and contractors cannot. So that means a company, any kind of company, can't contribute, but then also a single individual who is a contractor to the government cannot contribute. However, somebody who is high level at a contractor can. And that's something that the Biden campaign had mentioned they're going to look to eliminate, as well as looking to make it public whenever contractors reach out to the White House for any assistance on contracts. So that's another area that is potentially something where we're going to see some movement in the Biden administration. And then I think the last one is the pandemic, which, I'll be honest, there's not a ton to say here other than the Biden administration has issued a couple of executive orders in this area. And really what they are looking to do is use procurement or improve procurement of pandemic-related services and goods. And then they're also going to be looking at how the pandemic-related purchases need to result in improving procurement policies. So there's going to be a lot of kind of cross-reviewing happening here, but nothing direct that we're seeing other than, I think many folks are aware that there was the mandate for masks for contractors working on site at government facilities. I think that's been the most immediate pandemic-related action from this administration, but nothing else from the procurement side that we have seen yet that is direct, although there's, like I said, going to be a lot of that review. So I know I sped through things there towards the end. Jack, did you have other thoughts you wanted to add in?
Yeah, I'll just say we're happy to stick around for another 5 minutes or so if folks have additional questions, and I'll give you a second if you'd like to type something in. My only other thought about the pandemic is the relief bill that's going through reconciliation has to deal with a lot of economic relief, support for small businesses, et cetera. But there are a group of centrists on Capitol Hill that really want to move a package related to procurement and contracting early. They want to spend about $160 billion to speed vaccine rollouts and to make rapid testing more available across the country. That's sort of a bipartisan piece. I think the president is standing firm that he wants this huge relief package. And I think his feeling is if you start to piecemeal it, it can fall apart more easily. So he's standing firm for now, but I know he wants to direct a lot more money to defeating the coronavirus and getting everyone vaccinated as soon as possible, which is going much swifter than thought. Biden campaigned on 1 million shots a day in his first 100 days, and I think on Saturday we had over 2 million doses administered across the country. So it's working. And I don't see any other questions, Jayna. Is there anything else you wanted to add?
Well, I did see one question about the minimum wage.
Oh.
And the question was, the minimum wage talk, I think, is mostly for non-federal contracts, since the wage determination is by far higher than the $15 minimum that they are talking about. Am I wrong on this? And I think right now on the Hill, for sure, the discussion is about non-federal contracts. And I think the bringing up the wage determination relationship is relevant because the executive orders on the current executive order on minimum wage really applies to contractors that are subject to some of those wage determination kind of contracts. And most of those wage determinations are above $15, but there are some that are not. And so I think for some of those lower paying jobs that have wage determinations, I think, for instance, landscaping may be less than $10 now in some localities. So, some of those kinds of contracts are going to be impacted by a $15 minimum wage. A number of the others are not going to see any impact whatsoever, but there are going to be some that see that, as well as, I think, because of the way the wage determination requirements work out with fringe benefits, some companies do meet their determinations by providing certain fringe benefits, but this is going to require that the wage itself be $15, which may then mean in some instances that some companies cut back on the fringe benefits they provide if they're kind of on that cusp and depending on their industry. But generally, I do think that many of the wage determinations currently are above $15, so we may not see an impact in those areas.
Well, Jayna, this has been a fun discussion. Thank you so much for sharing your insights.
Thank you, Jack, and thanks so much for joining us. I know, especially with your background, you've got a lot of insight as to what's happening, especially on the climate change side of things. And I know that's also an area where you're passionate about things. So it's great to have your thoughts on that area.
Thanks, Jayna. And just as we close out, before you go, there'll be a survey that will pop up at the end of the presentation. We'd ask that you fill it out so that the next one of these we do is even a little better. Thank you all for joining.